The dirt was still dark and freshly turned when Elena Marsh stood at her husband's graveside the following morning, wondering how her sister could possibly expect her to smile through a room full of balloons and cake less than 24 hours after burying the only man she had ever truly loved. She had barely slept. Her black dress from the funeral still hung over the back of a chair in their bedroom. And the house, David's house, their house, still smelled faintly of the lilies the funeral home had insisted on sending home with her. An overwhelming, cloying sweetness that had already begun to feel less like comfort and more like a kind of quiet accusation, as though the flowers themselves were asking her what she planned to do now that she was alone. "Elena, please," her sister Claire had said on the phone that morning, her voice carrying the particular brittle cheerfulness of someone determined not to acknowledge how strange the request actually was. "It's Oliver's first birthday. I know the timing is terrible. I know it. But the whole family is already gathering, and honestly, sweetheart, I think being surrounded by people who love you might be better than sitting alone in that house with all his things staring back at you. The family needs to be together right now. Please come." Elena had wanted to say no. Every instinct in her exhausted, grief-hollowed body had wanted to close the curtains, unplug the phone, and simply exist in the quiet wreckage of the life she'd built with David for 11 years, a life that had ended, with a suddenness that still didn't feel entirely real. 6 days earlier, when his heart had simply stopped beating in his sleep beside her. No warning, no lingering illness to prepare her, just the terrible silence of a Tuesday morning when she'd reached over expecting warmth and found none. But there was something in Claire's voice, some undertone Elena couldn't quite name but felt instinctively, a kind of urgency beneath the forced cheerfulness that made her hesitate before refusing outright. And so, against every reasonable instinct, she had pulled on a simple gray dress instead of black, brushed her hair with hands that still trembled faintly from exhaustion and grief, and driven the 40 minutes to her sister's house, telling herself the entire way that perhaps Claire was right, that perhaps the distraction of her nephew's laughter might offer some small, temporary relief from the crushing weight settling permanently into her chest. She was not prepared for what actually waited for her there. Claire's house, a spacious colonial, on a quiet cul-de-sac that Elena had always privately found a little too aggressively tasteful, had been transformed into a riot of pastel balloons and streamers, a banner reading, "Happy First Birthday." Oliver strung across the mantelpiece, the dining table groaning under trays of finger sandwiches, and a towering cake decorated with fondant elephants. The sound of laughter and chatter reached Elena before she'd even fully stepped through the front door, and she stood for a moment in the entryway, absorbing the sheer, disorienting contrast between this bright celebratory chaos and the cold, silent house she'd just come from, where David's reading glasses still sat exactly where he'd left them on the nightstand, where his voicemail greeting still answered when she called his number just to hear his voice. A habit she'd already developed in 6 short days and suspected, with a kind of despairing clarity, she wouldn't be able to break for a very long time. Claire spotted her almost immediately and crossed the room with a bright, determined smile, pulling Elena into a hug that felt, despite its warmth, oddly stiff, as though her sister were performing comfort rather than simply offering it. "You made it," Claire said, pulling back to look at her with an expression Elena couldn't quite read, relief mixed with something else, something almost like anxiety. "How are you holding up?" "I'm here," Elena said simply, which felt like the most honest answer she could offer. The party unfolded around her in a blur of overlapping conversations and cheerful, determined normalcy that felt, to Elena's raw and grieving nerves, almost surreal in its persistence. Relatives she hadn't seen in months approached her with careful, sympathetic expressions, offering condolences in hushed, rehearsed-sounding phrases before quickly pivoting to safer topics. The weather, Oliver's remarkable growth over the past year, anything that would let them escape the discomfort of standing too close to someone else's fresh grief. Elena found herself nodding along to these exchanges with a kind of hollow, automatic politeness, accepting a paper plate of food she had no intention of eating, watching her 1-year-old nephew toddle unsteadily across the living room floor toward a pile of wrapping paper with a delighted, gap-toothed grin that, for one brief, unguarded moment, actually pulled a genuine, aching smile from somewhere deep inside her chest. It was during this moment, watching Oliver's small, delighted face, that Elena first noticed him. A man standing near the kitchen doorway, somewhat apart from the main cluster of party guests, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit that seemed considerably more formal than the occasion warranted, nursing a glass of wine with an expression of careful, watchful discomfort. Elena recognized him after a moment's confused hesitation. Nathan Cole, David's longtime business partner, a man she had met perhaps a dozen times over the years, at various company functions and holiday gatherings, always polished, always charming, always slightly too smooth in a way that David himself had occasionally joked about with a kind of affectionate exasperation. What struck Elena immediately, and what she would return to again and again in the difficult days that followed, was the sheer strangeness of Nathan's presence here at all. He wasn't family. He had no particular reason to be attending her one-year-old nephew's birthday party, and yet here he stood, clearly uncomfortable, clearly out of place, his eyes scanning the room with a watchfulness that felt, even in her grief-fogged state, subtly wrong. She made her way toward him, driven by a curiosity she couldn't quite articulate even to herself. "Nathan," she said, "I didn't expect to see you here." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly Elena almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, before his expression resolved into a carefully composed mask of sympathy. "Elena, I'm so sorry about David. He was one of the best men I've ever known. I hope it's all right that I came today. Claire mentioned the party, and I thought, given everything, it might be good to show some support for the family." The explanation was reasonable enough on its surface, and yet something about it sat wrong with Elena, a vague, nagging dissonance she couldn't fully name. "That's kind of you," she said carefully, watching his face for any further flicker of that earlier discomfort. "How are things at the office? I imagine David's absence is going to be difficult to manage." Another flicker, more pronounced this time. "We're managing," Nathan said, his voice carrying a note of forced casualness. "It's been a difficult transition, obviously, but we'll figure it out. David built something solid. It'll survive without him, even if it won't be quite the same." Elena nodded, filing away the strange, careful quality of his responses without yet understanding what precisely she was noticing. She excused herself a few minutes later, drifting toward the kitchen in search of a quiet moment away from the party's relentless cheerfulness. And it was there, standing near the doorway with a glass of water she didn't particularly want, that she overheard the fragment of conversation that would eventually unravel everything she thought she understood about the final months of her husband's life. Two of Claire's in-laws, standing near the pantry with their backs partially turned, were speaking in the hushed, urgent tones people use when they believe themselves unobserved. "Did you hear what David was asking about before he—" one of them began, before the other, catching sight of something over her companion's shoulder, made a small, sharp gesture and fell abruptly silent. Elena turned, following the direction of the woman's gaze, and found herself looking directly at both relatives, who quickly rearranged their expressions into the same careful, sympathetic masks everyone else at the party seemed to be wearing around her today. "Elena, honey," the first woman said, a distant cousin of Claire's husband whose name Elena couldn't quite recall in the moment. "We were just saying how strong you're being today. It's remarkable, really." The deflection was so obvious, so clearly designed to smooth over whatever had actually been under discussion, that Elena felt a small, cold certainty settle into her chest, cutting through the fog of grief with sudden, sharp clarity. Something had happened in the final months of David's life, something significant enough that multiple people in this room seemed to know about it, and something that everyone, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, seemed determined to keep from her. She said nothing more in that moment, simply nodded and excused herself with a murmured explanation about needing some air, but the seed of suspicion had been planted, and as she stepped out onto Claire's back porch, breathing in the cool afternoon air, she found her mind turning, almost involuntarily, back over the final weeks of David's life with a new and unsettling scrutiny. There had been changes, she realized now. Small things she had noticed at the time but attributed, without much thought, to the ordinary stresses of running a growing business. David had been working later than usual, several nights a week, arriving home well past 9, his expression tight and preoccupied in a way that had struck her at the time as simply exhaustion rather than anything more concerning. He had grown, over those final 2 months, noticeably more guarded about his phone, a habit that felt so unlike the open, easy trust that had defined their entire marriage that Elena had almost commented on it, before deciding, in the exhausted rush of her own demanding job, that she was likely reading too much into ordinary work stress. There had been, too, a strange visit from Nathan Cole himself, roughly 6 weeks before David's death, an unscheduled evening appearance that had ended with the two men closeted in David's home office for nearly 2 hours, their voices occasionally rising to a pitch Elena could hear faintly through the closed door. though she hadn't been able to make out specific words. When David had finally emerged, his expression had carried a tightness she'd rarely seen on his normally easygoing face, and when she'd asked gently what the visit had been about, he'd simply said, "Just some business stuff, nothing you need to worry about." A phrase that had felt, at the time, like ordinary marital deflection about work matters she genuinely had little interest in, but which now, standing on Claire's back porch with the seed of new suspicion taking root in her chest, felt considerably more significant. Elena returned to the party a short while later with a new careful watchfulness, observing the gathered relatives and family friends with an attentiveness she hadn't previously thought to apply, and it was during this renewed observation that she noticed something else entirely. Her mother-in-law, Patricia Marsh, engaged in a low, intense conversation with David's younger brother Thomas near the edge of the backyard, their body language carrying an unmistakable tension that seemed wildly out of place at a toddler's birthday celebration. When Elena drifted closer, ostensibly to admire the garden, both of them fell abruptly silent, offering her the same practiced sympathetic smiles she'd now encountered from nearly a dozen relatives throughout the afternoon. By the time the party wound down that evening, Elena's exhausted grief had been joined by a second, equally powerful emotion, a fierce, unsettled determination to understand exactly what everyone around her seemed to be so carefully avoiding discussing in her presence. She drove home that night to the empty house she'd shared with David for 11 years, and rather than collapsing immediately into the exhausted, grief-heavy sleep her body was desperately craving, she found herself instead standing in the doorway of his home office, the same room where that tense, unexplained meeting with Nathan Cole had unfolded 6 weeks earlier. The office remained largely untouched since David's death, and Elena had, until this moment, been deliberately avoiding the room entirely, unable to face the particular, concentrated intimacy of his handwriting on legal pads, his reading glasses folded beside his laptop, the specific arrangement of books and papers that constituted, in some indefinable way, a physical map of his inner life. But tonight, driven by the new urgent questions the birthday party had raised, she forced herself across the threshold, flipping on the desk lamp with hands that trembled slightly. She began, methodically, to search through the drawers of his desk, uncertain exactly what she was looking for, but trusting the same instinct that had first flagged the wrongness of Nathan's presence at the party, the strange, deflecting conversations, the careful, evasive answers. In the third drawer down, tucked beneath a stack of old tax documents, she found a thick manila envelope, unmarked except for a single word written in David's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting. Elena. Her hands shook as she opened it, and inside she found a collection of documents that would, over the following days and weeks, gradually unravel the entire hidden story of her husband's final months. Printed financial statements with certain figures circled in red pen, a series of handwritten notes in David's own hand, tracking dates and amounts that meant nothing to her at first glance, several photographs of documents that appeared to be bank statements belonging to accounts she didn't recognize, and near the bottom of the envelope, a small flash drive with a single word written on masking tape wrapped around it. Proof. Elena spent the remainder of that night and much of the following week in a kind of grief-fogged, methodical investigation that felt, in retrospect, like the only thing keeping her upright during those first devastating weeks of widowhood. The financial documents, once she'd forced herself to actually study them carefully rather than simply skim them in shock, revealed a pattern that took her considerable time and no small amount of research to fully understand. David had discovered, in the final months of his life, evidence that a significant sum of money had been quietly diverted from the company he co-owned with Nathan Cole, funds redirected through a series of shell accounts that, once traced carefully, appeared to lead back to Nathan himself. The flash drive, when Elena finally worked up the courage to plug it into her own laptop, contained a series of scanned documents and, more significantly, several audio recordings, apparently made secretly by David during a handful of tense conversations with Nathan over the preceding months. Conversations in which David could be heard, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, confronting his business partner about specific discrepancies in the company's financial records. Discrepancies that Nathan, in these recordings, alternately deflected, minimized, and eventually, in one particularly damning exchange, half admitted to while pleading with David to give him time to make things right before involving any formal authorities. Elena listened to these recordings with a growing, sick certainty settling into her stomach, understanding now, with painful clarity, exactly what those final tense months of David's life had actually contained. Not simply ordinary work stress, as she had assumed at the time, but a quiet, deeply personal betrayal by a man he had considered not just a business partner, but a genuine friend. A betrayal David had apparently chosen to investigate carefully and privately rather than immediately involving Elena, a choice that now, understood in the full context of his final months, revealed itself as an act of protection rather than the careless deflection she had initially, in her grief and confusion, half suspected. She began, in the days that followed this discovery, a careful, deliberate process of investigation that she approached with the same methodical patience David himself had apparently brought to his own final secret inquiry. She reached out first to David's longtime lawyer and close personal friend, Marcus Webb, a man who had handled the couple's estate planning for nearly a decade, and who Elena trusted implicitly, both for his professional discretion and for the genuine warmth of his friendship with David. Marcus, when Elena brought him the envelope and its contents during a tense meeting in his downtown office, absorbed the evidence with a grim, careful attention that gradually shifted, as he worked through the documents, into an expression of dawning, troubled recognition. "He came to see me about 6 weeks before he passed," Marcus admitted, setting down the papers with visible reluctance. "He didn't tell me everything, not in full detail, but he mentioned he'd discovered some irregularities in the company's finances and wanted to understand his legal options before he moved forward with any formal action. I encouraged him to bring the documentation to me properly so we could build a solid case, but he said he wanted to gather a bit more proof first, that he didn't want to make accusations he couldn't fully substantiate. Elena, I'm so sorry. I had no idea the situation was this serious, or I would have pushed him harder to move faster." "Why wouldn't he tell me any of this?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the raw, wounded confusion that had been building since she'd first opened that manila envelope. "We told each other everything, or at least, I thought we did." Marcus considered his answer carefully before responding. "I think he was trying to protect you, honestly. From what he told me, he was worried about the stress it would cause you, especially given how close Nathan had become to both of you over the years, not just as a business partner, but as a genuine friend. I think he wanted to be absolutely certain of the full scope of what was happening before he brought it to you, so you wouldn't have to carry the uncertainty and worry while he worked through the investigation. He mentioned more than once that he didn't want you losing sleep over something he was already handling." This explanation, however understandable in its underlying intention, brought Elena little comfort in the moment, layering a fresh grief atop her existing loss. Not just the grief of losing her husband, but the grief of understanding that he had spent the final weeks of his life carrying a significant, painful burden entirely alone, protecting her from a truth he never got the chance to fully reveal himself. With Marcus's professional guidance and support, Elena began, over the following weeks, to more fully piece together the scope of Nathan Cole's betrayal, a process that involved careful review of company financial records, consultation with a forensic accountant Marcus recommended, and eventually, a series of increasingly pointed conversations with various family members and colleagues who, Elena slowly came to realize, had known considerably more about the unfolding situation than they had initially let on during that uncomfortable birthday party. Her mother-in-law, Patricia, when Elena finally worked up the resolve to ask her directly about the tense conversation she'd witnessed with Thomas at the party, broke down almost immediately, tears of guilt and relief mixing together as she finally unburdened herself of a secret she had apparently been carrying with considerable difficulty. "David called me, about a month before he passed," Patricia admitted, sitting across from Elena at her kitchen table with visible distress. "He didn't give me full details, but he told me he'd discovered something troubling about Nathan, something involving the business, and he asked me not to say anything to you yet because he wanted to handle it carefully, without causing you unnecessary worry before he had all the facts sorted out. I've felt sick about it ever since he passed, honestly, wondering if I should have said something sooner, but I made him a promise, and I didn't know how to break it, especially not right after we'd just lost him." Thomas, David's younger brother, offered a similar account when Elena approached him separately, revealing that David had confided in him as well, seeking his brother's advice about how to handle the delicate situation without permanently damaging either his marriage or his business partnership, if it turned out the discrepancies had some innocent explanation he hadn't yet uncovered. He genuinely wanted to give Nathan a chance to explain himself or make things right before escalating things formally, Thomas told her. That was David, always trying to find the most fair, least destructive path forward, even when someone had genuinely wronged him. I told him he was being too generous, honestly, given what he'd already found, but he wanted to handle it his own way. These conversations, painful and revealing in equal measure, gradually assembled themselves into a fuller, more complete picture of David's final months. A careful, deliberate investigation into his business partner's betrayal, conducted quietly and methodically, shared in fragments with a small circle of trusted family members, while deliberately withheld from Elena herself, out of a protective love that Elena found herself, even amid her grief and confusion, ultimately unable to resent, understanding it as an extension of the same devoted care that had defined their entire marriage. Nathan Cole, meanwhile, seemed to sense, over these same weeks, that Elena's quiet, careful investigation was gradually closing in around him, and his behavior grew increasingly erratic and defensive as the weeks progressed. He called her several times, ostensibly to check in on how she was managing her grief, calls that Elena recognized, with growing clarity, as thinly disguised attempts to gauge exactly how much she had discovered about the situation David had left behind. "I just want you to know," Nathan told her during one particularly uncomfortable call, "that whatever David might have told you, or whatever documents you might have found, there's usually a more complicated explanation than it might initially appear. Business finances get complicated, Elena. I'd hate for you to draw conclusions based on incomplete information, especially during such a difficult time." The careful, preemptive defensiveness of this comment, delivered before Elena had even directly confronted him about anything specific, only reinforced her growing certainty about the true scope of his betrayal, and she found herself, in these weeks, drawing on a reserve of patience and careful strategy that surprised even her own understanding of her capabilities, determined to build a case thorough and undeniable enough that Nathan would have no room left for the kind of deflection and minimization he'd apparently already successfully deployed against David during those final tense conversations captured on the flash drive's audio recordings. It was nearly 2 months into this careful, methodical investigation, with Marcus's professional guidance and the forensic accountant's growing documentation of the financial irregularities steadily building an increasingly undeniable case, that the true scope of Nathan's scheme finally came into complete, damning focus. The forensic accountant, a meticulous, soft-spoken woman named Rebecca Chow, who had spent nearly 3 weeks combing through years of company financial records, presented her findings to Elena and Marcus during a tense meeting in Marcus's office, findings that revealed a betrayal considerably more extensive and calculated than even the documents David had gathered before his death had fully captured. Nathan, it emerged, had been quietly siphoning funds from the company for nearly 3 years, using a sophisticated system of shell accounts and falsified vendor invoices to disguise the theft within the company's routine operating expenses. The total sum, once Rebecca's careful forensic analysis had traced every fraudulent transaction back to its source, exceeded $800,000. Funds Nathan had apparently used to support a lifestyle considerably more extravagant than his official salary could have justified, including a vacation property in another state that he had, notably, never mentioned to either David or Elena during years of close personal and professional friendship. "This is a textbook case of embezzlement," Rebecca told them, laying out her documentation with methodical precision. "The pattern is clear, consistent, and thoroughly documented. Combined with the audio recordings your husband captured, where Mr. Cole essentially admits to diverting funds while asking for time to make things right, I think you have more than sufficient evidence to pursue both criminal charges and a civil suit for recovery of the stolen funds." Elena absorbed this confirmation with a complicated mixture of vindication and fresh, aching grief, understanding now, with painful completeness, exactly what David had discovered and been carrying alone during the final weeks of his life, exactly how thoroughly a man he had trusted as a close friend for nearly a decade had betrayed that trust, and exactly how much emotional weight David had chosen to shoulder privately rather than burden her with uncertainty before he had assembled a complete, undeniable case. The confrontation with Nathan Cole, when it finally arrived, took place not through some dramatic public accusation, but through a carefully orchestrated meeting arranged by Marcus, held in a conference room at his law office, with Rebecca's full forensic documentation laid out on the table and a company lawyer present to formalize whatever resolution emerged from the discussion. Nathan arrived at that meeting with the same carefully composed expression he'd worn throughout the entire ordeal, though Elena noticed immediately a new tightness around his eyes, a barely suppressed panic that suggested he understood, before a single word had been spoken, exactly how thoroughly his scheme had finally been uncovered. "Elena," he began, his voice carrying a practiced conciliatory warmth that had entirely lost its previous effectiveness now that she understood its true purpose. "I know this looks bad, but I want you to understand the full context before—" I have the recordings, Nathan, Elena said quietly, cutting through whatever careful justification he had prepared. I have David's documents, and I have a complete forensic accounting of every dollar you diverted from the company over the past 3 years. I'm not interested in your context. I'm interested in understanding why you let my husband spend the final weeks of his life carrying the burden of your betrayal, and why you sat in my sister's living room at my nephew's birthday party, less than a week after burying him, pretending to offer your condolences while worrying, the entire time, about whether I'd discovered what you'd done to him. The room fell into a heavy, charged silence, and Nathan's carefully maintained composure finally, visibly cracked, his shoulders sagging with an exhaustion that suggested he had been carrying his own considerable weight of guilt and fear throughout these preceding weeks. David was going to ruin me, he finally admitted, his voice raw and stripped of its earlier polish. I made mistakes, Elena, serious ones. I know that. I got in over my head with some bad investments years ago, and I made a decision I've regretted every single day since, to cover the losses using company funds rather than admitting the mistake to David directly. I told myself I'd pay it back eventually, quietly, before anyone ever noticed. When David found the discrepancies, I begged him to give me time to make it right rather than destroying both my career and our friendship over it. I never wanted any of this to happen the way it did. He didn't die because of what you did, Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying the careful precision of a lawyer determined to keep the conversation grounded in fact, rather than spiraling into unproductive emotional confusion. David had a cardiac event unrelated to any of this, but that doesn't excuse the fraud, Nathan, and it certainly doesn't excuse the fact that you spent the following weeks after his death actively trying to obscure the evidence and mislead his widow about what he'd discovered. The meeting that followed unfolded with a kind of grim, methodical inevitability. Nathan's lawyer, present via video call, quickly recognizing the overwhelming strength of the evidence arrayed against his client, and beginning almost immediately to negotiate the terms of a resolution that would avoid the full public exposure and criminal consequences of a formal prosecution in exchange for complete restitution of the stolen funds, forfeiture of Nathan's remaining ownership stake in the company, and a formal, legally binding admission of the fraud that would protect Elena from any future legal complications regarding the business's ownership structure. Elena, working closely with Marcus throughout these negotiations, ultimately agreed to pursue this civil resolution rather than pushing for criminal prosecution, a decision she made not out of any particular mercy toward Nathan, but out of a clear-eyed, practical understanding that recovering the stolen funds and formally severing his connection to the company David had built mattered more to her, in the end, than the additional, uncertain process of a lengthy criminal trial that might delay her own healing considerably longer than she was willing to accept. It was during the final stages of settling David's estate, several weeks after the confrontation with Nathan had concluded with a signed settlement agreement, that Marcus revealed one final piece of David's careful, hidden preparation, a sealed video recording David had made and left with Marcus's office roughly 3 weeks before his death, with explicit instructions that it should only be shared with Elena if his investigation into Nathan's fraud remained unresolved at the time of his death. A contingency David had apparently prepared for, with the same careful, methodical thoroughness he'd brought to every other aspect of his life. Elena watched the recording alone, in the quiet privacy of Marcus's office, David's familiar face appearing on the screen with an expression that carried, even in the recorded stillness, the particular warmth and steadiness that had defined their entire marriage. "Elena," David began, his voice carrying an unmistakable tenderness that brought fresh tears to her eyes within the first few seconds. "If you're watching this, it means I wasn't able to resolve things with Nathan the way I'd hoped, or something happened to me before I got the chance to explain everything myself. I want you to know, first and most importantly, how much I love you, and how sorry I am for keeping this from you these past weeks. I know that probably feels like a betrayal of its own, and I understand if you're angry about that, but I promise you, I only kept this from you because I couldn't stand the thought of you carrying this worry alongside everything else you already manage in your own demanding career. I wanted to handle it, resolve it cleanly, and only bring you into it once I had a solution rather than just a painful, unresolved problem." David's recorded image paused for a moment, visibly gathering himself before continuing. "I found evidence that Nathan's been stealing from the company, and it broke my heart, honestly. More than the money itself. I trusted that man like a brother for almost a decade. But I want you to understand something important, Elena. Whatever happens with this situation, whatever it takes to resolve it, Don't let bitterness become the thing that defines the rest of your life. I know that might sound strange, coming from someone who's clearly furious about being betrayed by a close friend. But I've thought about this a lot these past few weeks, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Nathan's choices are his own to carry. Don't let his betrayal become a weight you carry too, on top of everything else. Handle it fairly, protect what we've built together, but then let it go. Build something good from whatever's left. That's what I'd want for you, more than anything else. He smiled then, the same warm, familiar smile Elena had fallen in love with 11 years earlier, and added, I love you more than I've ever managed to say out loud as often as I should have. Whatever happens, know that the 11 years we had together were the best of my entire life, and I wouldn't trade a single day of them, even the hard ones, for anything else. Take care of yourself. Take care of Oliver and Claire and everyone else who loves you. And please, please don't let this steal your joy along with everything else it's already taken. The recording ended and Elena sat alone in Marcus's quiet office for a long time afterward, tears streaming freely down her face, absorbing not just the fresh, aching grief of hearing her husband's voice one final time, but the profound clarity of his final request, a request that would, over the following months and years, gradually reshape how she chose to carry both her grief and the painful betrayal Nathan Cole had visited upon them both. The months that followed brought a slow, deliberate process of rebuilding, both practical and emotional. The financial settlement with Nathan, finalized several weeks after his confrontation meeting, restored the full $800,000 to the company's accounts, funds that Elena, now serving as majority owner following David's death, and Nathan's forfeited stake, redirected towards stabilizing the business during its difficult leadership transition. She brought in a trusted operations manager who had worked closely with David for years to help steer daily operations, while she herself gradually took on a more active role in the company's strategic direction, a responsibility she approached initially with considerable uncertainty, but increasingly, over subsequent months, with a growing confidence that surprised even her own expectations of herself. She remained close to Oliver throughout this period, deliberately and consciously separating her nephew's innocent presence in her life from the painful complications that had unfolded around his first birthday party, understanding that the child himself bore no responsibility for the timing of Nathan's exposure or the family tensions that had briefly surfaced in its aftermath. She visited Claire's house regularly throughout the following months, watching Oliver grow and change with the particular tender attentiveness of someone finding unexpected comfort in a child's uncomplicated joy amid an otherwise complicated season of grief and reckoning. Claire herself, once the full scope of the situation became clear, expressed considerable guilt about her own role in the strange discomfort that had characterized that first birthday party, admitting to Elena during a tearful conversation several weeks later that she had, in fact, sensed something was troubling several family members in the lead-up to the party, but had chosen not to press for details, focused instead on simply getting everyone gathered together in what she genuinely believed at the time was Elena's best interest. I should have trusted my instincts that something was wrong, Claire admitted. I just didn't know what, and I didn't want to burden you with more uncertainty right after losing David. I'm sorry if it felt like everyone was keeping secrets from you during such a painful time. I understand why everyone made the choices they did, Elena told her, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she genuinely meant it. David wanted to protect me. Everyone else was just trying to honor that, even without fully understanding what they were protecting me from. I can't be angry at people for trying to show love, even when it came out complicated. The relationships within the broader family, tested significantly by the revelations of that difficult period, gradually settled into a new, more honest equilibrium over the following months. Patricia and Thomas, both of whom had carried the weight of David's confided secret with considerable private guilt, found their relationship with Elena deepening in the aftermath of the full truth finally emerging, a paradoxical strengthening born from shared grief and shared understanding of exactly how much David had tried to shoulder alone during his final weeks. Elena's own healing, meanwhile, unfolded with the particular, uneven rhythm that grief so often follows, moments of genuine peace and forward momentum interspersed with sudden, unexpected waves of fresh sorrow, triggered by the smallest, most mundane reminders. David's handwriting on an old grocery list, the particular way morning light fell across his side of their bed, the smell of his cologne lingering faintly on a jacket she couldn't quite bring herself to donate to charity. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long while still. But threaded through this uneven grief was the steady, guiding presence of David's final recorded message. his explicit request that she not allow Nathan's betrayal to define the remainder of her life, a request Elena found herself returning to again and again during the difficult months of settling the estate, navigating her new role within the company, and rebuilding her understanding of what her life might look like without the partner who had shaped nearly every aspect of it for over a decade. She began, roughly 8 months after David's death, to channel some of her grief and her newly expanded resources into a cause that had mattered deeply to him throughout his life. A scholarship fund, established in David's name through the local community foundation, supporting first-generation college students pursuing business degrees, a cause that connected directly to David's own background as the first person in his family to attend college, a foundation of opportunity he had always credited as the single most transformative element of his entire professional trajectory. The scholarship fund grew steadily over the following year, drawing support not just from Elena's own contributions, but from a growing circle of David's former colleagues and business associates who remembered him fondly and wanted to contribute to a legacy that reflected the genuine values he'd embodied throughout his career: integrity, patience, and a quiet, steady commitment to giving people fair opportunities to prove themselves, even when, as with Nathan, that generosity of spirit had ultimately been betrayed. Elena also found herself, during this same period, gradually reclaiming aspects of her own identity and interests that had, over the years of her demanding career and busy marriage, been somewhat set aside. She returned to painting, a hobby she'd abandoned nearly a decade earlier under the pressures of professional obligations, finding in the quiet, meditative practice a genuine outlet for processing the complicated layers of grief, anger, and eventual acceptance that defined her ongoing healing process. Several of these paintings, created during this reflective period, eventually found their way into a small local gallery exhibition, a development that surprised Elena considerably, but that felt in its own quiet way, like a genuine reclamation of a part of herself that had existed independently of both her marriage and her professional identity. The company itself, meanwhile, stabilized considerably under the combined leadership of Elena and the operations manager she'd brought on board, eventually returning to the steady, sustainable growth trajectory David had originally built it toward, before Nathan's fraud and subsequent exposure had temporarily thrown its financial stability into question. Elena approached her expanded role within the business with a particular philosophy that drew directly from the painful lessons of the preceding year: rigorous, transparent financial oversight, clear communication among leadership, and a company culture that valued honesty over the kind of comfortable, unquestioned trust that had allowed Nathan's betrayal to go undetected for nearly 3 years before David's careful investigation finally uncovered it. It was nearly 1 year after that difficult, disorienting first birthday party, with its uncomfortable whispered conversations and unsettling discoveries, that Oliver's second birthday arrived, and Elena found herself once again driving the familiar 40 minutes to Claire's house, though this time with a considerably different set of emotions accompanying the journey. The party itself carried a noticeably different atmosphere than the previous year's gathering, quieter in some ways, more genuine in others, free of the strange undercurrents of secrecy and careful avoidance that had defined that earlier difficult celebration. Elena arrived to find Claire's house decorated with the same cheerful abundance of balloons and streamers, though this time she found herself genuinely able to enjoy the celebration rather than simply enduring it, watching her now considerably more mobile and vocal nephew toddle enthusiastically around the living room, delighting the assembled family with an increasingly impressive vocabulary of new words. "Auntie Lena!" Oliver called out upon spotting her, using the nickname he'd recently begun favoring, and Elena felt her heart swell with a genuine, uncomplicated warmth that would have felt almost impossible during that first difficult party a year earlier. She spent much of the afternoon in easy, genuine conversation with family members, whose earlier awkwardness and careful avoidance had, in the intervening year, given way to a considerably more open and honest connection. The shared experience of navigating the painful revelations surrounding David's death, having paradoxically drawn much of the family closer together, rather than further apart, at least among those who had responded to the situation with genuine support rather than continued secrecy or self-protection. Late in the afternoon, as the party began winding down and several guests started gathering their things to depart, Elena found a quiet moment to step out into Claire's backyard, drawn by the same instinct for solitude that had guided her outside during that far more difficult first party the year before. The yard looked much the same as it had a year earlier, though the late afternoon light carried a softer, more golden quality than she remembered from that earlier, more painful visit, and Elena found herself settling onto the same porch steps where she had once stood, overwhelmed by grief and unsettling suspicion, absorbing instead a considerably more peaceful, if still bittersweet, moment of quiet reflection. She thought, sitting there, of the tree David had loved most in their own backyard, an old, sprawling oak he'd planted himself during their first year in the house they'd shared together. A tree that had grown over the following decade into a substantial, sheltering presence that Elena had taken, in recent months, to visiting regularly, sitting beneath its branches with her sketchbook, finding in its steady, patient growth a kind of quiet metaphor for her own gradual, ongoing healing. She thought of David's final recorded message, his gentle, insistent request that she not allow bitterness to define the remainder of her life, a request she had, over the preceding year, worked deliberately and consciously to honor, even during the most difficult moments of confronting Nathan's betrayal and navigating the complicated aftermath of his exposure. She thought of the scholarship fund now bearing his name, supporting a growing cohort of first-generation college students pursuing the same kind of opportunity that had once transformed his own life. She thought of her own rediscovered passion for painting, of the small gallery exhibition that had, in its own quiet way, marked the beginning of a new chapter of her own identity, distinct from but not diminished by the profound loss that had precipitated it. "I thought the hardest day of my life was saying goodbye," she reflected, watching the golden late afternoon light filter through Claire's backyard trees. "I never imagined that the day after would reveal a truth he couldn't tell me himself. A betrayal I never saw coming from someone I'd trusted for years. Losing him broke my heart in a way I'm not sure will ever fully heal. But honoring his courage, choosing to handle that painful revelation with the same integrity and patience he'd shown throughout his own careful investigation, that helped me find a strength and a resilience I'm not sure I ever would have discovered otherwise." The grief remained. She understood now. Sitting quietly on her sister's back porch steps, a full year after that first disorienting birthday party, a permanent companion rather than a temporary visitor destined to eventually depart entirely. But it no longer controlled the entirety of her days the way it once had, no longer defined every waking moment with the same crushing, all-consuming weight it had carried during those first difficult weeks and months. She had learned through the painful, unexpected journey of uncovering David's hidden final investigation and confronting the betrayal he'd worked so hard to protect her from, that grief and healing were not, in fact, opposing forces locked in some inevitable competition, but rather two threads of the same complicated fabric, woven together into a life that continued, however painfully, however imperfectly, to move forward. Oliver's laughter drifted out from the house behind her, bright and unburdened, and Elena rose from the porch steps, brushing off her dress, and walked back inside to rejoin the family that had, over this difficult, transformative year, revealed both its capacity for painful secrecy and its deeper, more enduring capacity for genuine love and support, carrying with her, as she crossed the threshold back into the warm, golden light of her nephew's second birthday celebration, not the crushing weight of unresolved grief and suspicion that had defined her first visit to this house 1 year earlier, but something quieter, steadier, and considerably more at peace. The hard-won understanding that honoring someone's memory sometimes means confronting painful truths rather than avoiding them, and that healing, however slow and uneven its progress, remains always stubbornly possible, even after the most profound and unexpected losses. There was a particular evening roughly 4 months after that difficult confrontation with Nathan Cole in Marcus's conference room that Elena would come to think of, in later reflection, as a genuine turning point in her own understanding of what justice actually required in a situation this layered and painful. She had gone, at Marcus's gentle suggestion, to a support group for people navigating sudden loss, combined with complicated financial or legal aftermaths, a small gathering that met weekly in the basement of a community center not far from her own neighborhood. And it was there, among a room full of strangers, each carrying their own version of grief tangled with betrayal, that Elena first began to fully articulate, out loud, the complicated tangle of emotions she'd been carrying largely alone since that unsettling first birthday party. "I keep waiting to feel angry enough," she admitted to the group during one particularly raw session, several months into her attendance. "Everyone around me seems to assume I should be consumed with fury toward Nathan, and there are moments when I am genuinely, viscerally furious. But mostly what I feel is this strange, exhausting sadness that has almost nothing to do with him at all. I'm not grieving what he took from the company. I'm grieving that David spent his final weeks carrying this alone, protecting me from something I should have been allowed to help him carry." The group's facilitator, a soft-spoken grief counselor named Dr. Helena Voss, who had built her practice specifically around supporting people navigating exactly this kind of layered, complicated loss, offered Elena a perspective during that session that would stay with her throughout the remainder of her healing process. Betrayal grief and loss grief often get tangled together in ways that make each one harder to process individually, Dr. Voss explained. It's not uncommon to feel like you're failing at grieving properly because the anger keeps interrupting the sadness, or the sadness keeps softening the anger you feel you're supposed to sustain. Give yourself permission to feel both, in whatever order and intensity they arrive, without judging whether you're doing grief correctly. There isn't a correct way to carry something this complicated. This permission, offered so simply and directly, provided Elena with a kind of framework she hadn't previously possessed for understanding her own uneven emotional landscape during those difficult months, and she found herself returning to Dr. Voss's words repeatedly throughout the following year, particularly during moments when the grief and the anger seemed to arrive simultaneously, tangled together in ways that made each individually harder to fully process. It was also during this period, roughly 5 months after David's death, that Elena finally worked up the emotional resolve to have a fuller, more searching conversation with Claire about the specific dynamics that had unfolded during that first disorienting birthday party. A conversation that revealed layers of the family's awareness she hadn't fully appreciated during her initial, grief-fogged pass through the situation. "I need you to be completely honest with me," Elena told her sister, sitting across from her at Claire's kitchen table on a quiet weekday evening, several weeks after the forensic accounting had confirmed the full scope of Nathan's fraud. "Did you know something was wrong before the party? Is that why you insisted I come, even though it seemed like such a strange thing to ask of me the day after David's funeral?" Claire's expression carried a complicated mixture of guilt and genuine uncertainty as she considered her answer. "I knew something was off," she finally admitted. "David had called me, actually, about 3 weeks before he passed. He didn't give me details, not really, just said he was dealing with something difficult at work and asked if I could help keep an eye on you. Make sure you weren't isolating too much if things got stressful at home." I didn't understand at the time what he meant, and honestly, I still feel terrible that I didn't push him for more information when I had the chance. When he died so suddenly, I think some part of me insisted on the birthday party partly because I genuinely believed being around family would help you, but also because I had this vague, unsettled feeling that something more was going on. And I didn't know what else to do with that feeling except try to keep you close, surrounded by people, even if I couldn't fully explain why that instinct felt so urgent. This revelation that David had reached out to Claire as well during his final weeks, quietly enlisting his sister-in-law's help in a peripheral protective role without revealing the full scope of what he was investigating, added yet another layer to Elena's understanding of exactly how carefully and deliberately David had worked to shield her during that difficult period, marshaling a small, discreet network of trusted family members to watch over her well-being without ever fully revealing the painful truth he was working to uncover. "I wish he'd just told me," Elena said quietly, not for the first time since this entire painful journey had begun. "I know he thought he was protecting me, and in some ways I understand why he made that choice. But I keep thinking about how alone he must have felt, carrying all of this by himself, even while surrounded by people who loved him." "I think," Claire said carefully, "that's exactly why he reached out to all of us the way he did, in these small fragmented pieces. He wasn't trying to carry it entirely alone. He was trying to build a support system around you without you knowing it existed yet, so that whatever happened, whether he resolved things himself or ran out of time to do so, you wouldn't actually be facing it without people who already understood at least part of what was happening. I think, in his own way, that was David's version of not leaving you alone with it, even though it looked, from your perspective, exactly like he had." This reframing, offered by her sister during that quiet kitchen table conversation, provided Elena with a genuinely new way of understanding David's choices during his final weeks, transforming what had initially felt like a painful, isolating secret into something closer to a careful, if imperfect, act of distributed protection, a final expression of his enduring love and care even in the face of an uncertain and ultimately tragic outcome he could never have fully anticipated. The financial and legal resolution of Nathan's fraud, meanwhile, continued unfolding through its own necessary bureaucratic processes throughout these same months, with Marcus and Rebecca Chow working methodically alongside Elena to ensure every dollar of the settlement was properly documented and transferred, and to formalize the legal separation of Nathan's ownership interest from the company David had built. This process, while considerably less emotionally fraught than the initial confrontation and revelation had been, still required Elena's regular active engagement over several months, a demand that, paradoxically, she came to appreciate as its own kind of grounding structure during an otherwise disorienting period of grief. Having something concrete to actually do, some tangible problem I could work towards solving alongside people I trusted, gave me a strange kind of anchor during those months. Elena reflected later, during a conversation with Dr. Voss's support group. I think if I'd just been left alone with my grief, with nothing else demanding my careful attention, I might have simply drowned in it for considerably longer than I actually did. The investigation, painful as it was, gave me something to hold on to, a way of honoring David that felt active and purposeful rather than just passively enduring the loss. It was during the same period that Elena also began, gradually and with considerable initial hesitation, to reconnect with aspects of her own professional life that had, for the first several months following David's death, remained almost entirely dormant. She had taken an extended leave from her own career, a mid-level position at a regional marketing firm she had held for nearly 6 years before David's death, and as the practical demands of settling his estate and resolving the situation with Nathan gradually eased over subsequent months, she found herself facing a genuine question about what her own professional future might look like going forward, particularly given her newly expanded responsibilities within David's company. After considerable reflection, and several long conversations with both Marcus and the operations manager she'd brought on to help stabilize the business, Elena made the decision to leave her marketing position entirely, transitioning into a more active, permanent leadership role within David's company, a decision that surprised several people in her life who had assumed she might prefer to maintain some professional distance from an enterprise so closely associated with both her husband's memory and the painful betrayal that had unfolded within it. I thought about walking away from the company entirely, more than once, Elena admitted to Marcus during one of their regular meetings as the estate settlement moved toward its final stages. Selling it, taking the proceeds, building an entirely separate life disconnected from everything David built. But the more time I spent working alongside the team he assembled, learning the business he was so proud of, the more I realized that walking away would feel like letting Nathan's betrayal have the final word over something David spent 15 years building with genuine integrity and care. I don't want that. I want to be the one who gets to decide what this company becomes next, not the fallout of someone else's fraud. This decision, once made, brought with it its own considerable learning curve, as Elena worked to develop genuine expertise in an industry, industrial equipment distribution, that had been David's professional world for nearly 2 decades, but remained, for her, largely unfamiliar territory. She approached this challenge with the same methodical determination that had characterized her earlier investigation into Nathan's fraud, spending long hours studying the company's operations, meeting individually with every senior employee to understand their roles and concerns, and gradually developing her own leadership voice within an organization that had, for its entire history, been shaped almost entirely by David's particular management philosophy and personal relationships with clients and vendors alike. The employees themselves, many of whom had worked alongside David for years and had been directly affected by the uncertainty surrounding both his sudden death and the subsequent revelation of Nathan's fraud, responded to Elena's growing involvement with a cautious but gradually warming respect, several of them commenting, over the following months, on how much of David's particular blend of rigor and genuine care for his people they recognized reemerging in Elena's own developing leadership approach. "You handle things the way he did," one longtime warehouse manager named Frank told her during a particularly difficult stretch nearly 8 months after David's death, as the company worked through the operational disruptions caused by Nathan's departure and the broader restructuring that followed. Careful, thorough, but never losing sight of the actual people involved. I worked for David for 12 years, and I'll tell you honestly, I wasn't sure what would happen to this place after he passed, especially once everything came out about Nathan. But watching you these past months, I think he'd be proud of what you're building here. Comments like these, accumulated gradually over the difficult months of transition and rebuilding, provided Elena with a particular kind of validation that went beyond simple professional accomplishment, offering her tangible evidence that she was successfully honoring not just David's memory in the abstract, but the concrete, practical legacy of the company and the people whose livelihoods depended on its continued success. A responsibility she came to carry with genuine seriousness and, increasingly, genuine pride. The scholarship fund Elena established in David's name, meanwhile, continued its own steady growth throughout this same period, and it was during the selection process for its second cohort of recipients, roughly 14 months after David's death, that Elena found herself experiencing one of the more unexpectedly healing moments of her entire ongoing grief journey. She had insisted on personally reviewing each scholarship application, wanting to maintain a genuine, hands-on connection to the cause, rather than simply delegating the entire selection process to the community foundation administering the broader fund. And among the applications for that second cohort, she encountered the story of a young woman named Sofia Reyes, the first person in her family to pursue a college education, working 2 jobs to support both her studies and her younger siblings, while her own parents navigated significant financial hardship. Sophia's application essay describing her determination to build a career in business despite having no family precedent or financial safety net to draw upon resonated with Elena in a way that felt, reading it late one evening in the quiet of her own living room, almost like hearing an echo of David's own life story. The same fierce, determined hunger to build something meaningful from difficult circumstances that had originally shaped David's entire professional trajectory decades earlier. Elena made a point, once Sophia was selected as one of the scholarship's recipients, of personally attending the small reception the Community Foundation organized to introduce the new cohort of scholars. And it was there, meeting Sophia in person for the first time, that Elena found herself sharing in fuller detail than she had with almost anyone outside her immediate family, the story of David's own journey and the values that had led her to establish the scholarship in his name. "He always said the hardest part wasn't the studying," Elena told Sophia during their conversation. "It was believing you actually belonged in rooms where nobody else looked like you or came from where you came from." He carried that belief with him his entire career, this determination to prove, both to himself and to everyone who might have doubted him, that where you started didn't have to determine where you ended up. I think he'd be genuinely thrilled to know that belief is still helping people, even now. This connection with Sophia, and with several subsequent scholarship recipients over the following years, became one of the most consistently meaningful elements of Elena's ongoing healing process, offering her a tangible, forward-looking way of honoring David's memory that felt considerably more nourishing than simply dwelling on the painful circumstances of his final months or the betrayal that had complicated her grief so significantly during that first difficult year. Nathan Cole, for his part, largely disappeared from Elena's life and from the broader community following the settlement of the fraud case, relocating, according to occasional unsolicited updates that reached her through mutual acquaintances, to another state entirely, where he apparently attempted to rebuild some version of his professional life away from the considerable reputational damage the exposure of his fraud had caused within their original business community. Elena found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she experienced relatively little curiosity about his subsequent fate, having concluded, through her own difficult process of reckoning with his betrayal, that continuing to track his life or fortunes would only serve to keep her own emotional energy tethered to a chapter of her story she had with considerable effort worked to close. "I used to think closure meant getting some kind of dramatic, satisfying justice," she reflected during a later conversation with Dr. Voss's support group, nearly 2 years after David's death. Watching him face serious consequences, maybe even go to prison, something that would feel like the story had been properly, completely resolved. But what I actually found, once the settlement was finalized and I stopped tracking his life, was that closure looked more like simply no longer needing to think about him at all. His betrayal doesn't get to occupy space in my daily life anymore. That, more than any particular legal outcome, is what actually let me move forward. This hard-won equilibrium, achieved gradually over roughly 2 years of careful, deliberate healing work, informed the particular quality of peace Elena carried with her into that second birthday party for Oliver, and continued to deepen and stabilize throughout the subsequent years as she built an increasingly full and purposeful life, one that honored David's memory not through perpetual mourning, but through the concrete, ongoing work of the company she had grown to genuinely love leading, the scholarship fund that continued supporting students who reminded her, year after year, of the values David had carried throughout his own life, and the rekindled creative practice of her painting, which eventually evolved from a private, meditative outlet into a small but genuine secondary pursuit. Her work featured in several subsequent local exhibitions, and eventually purchased by collectors who had no idea of the complicated grief and healing journey that had originally brought these particular canvases into being. Standing years later beneath the sprawling oak tree David had planted during their first year together, now grown considerably larger and more established than it had been during that difficult first year of widowhood, Elena found herself reflecting on the full R of everything that difficult first birthday party had eventually set into motion. The painful discovery of David's hidden investigation, the careful, patient work of uncovering Nathan's full betrayal, the difficult but ultimately clarifying conversations with family members who had each, in their own way, tried to protect her during those final weeks of David's life, the gradual rebuilding of both the company and her own professional identity, and the deeper, more enduring understanding of grief and healing that Dr. Voss's support group had helped her develop during those early difficult months. I thought the hardest day of my life was saying goodbye, she thought again, sitting beneath the familiar shade of David's tree with her sketchbook open on her lap, its pages filled with the accumulated evidence of years of careful, healing creative practice. I never imagined that the day after would reveal the truth he couldn't tell me himself. Losing him broke my heart more completely than I believed any single loss could break a person. But honoring his courage, choosing to face that painful truth directly, rather than allowing it to remain buried alongside him, helped me find my own courage in turn. A strength I'm not certain I would have ever discovered if grief alone, without the added complication of his hidden investigation, had been the only thing I'd been asked to carry. The oak tree's leaves rustled gently overhead in the late afternoon breeze, and Elena closed her sketchbook, gathering herself to return inside where Oliver, now considerably older and more talkative with each passing year, would undoubtedly be waiting to show her his latest enthusiastic discovery, whatever small, delighted obsession currently occupied his rapidly developing curiosity about the world. She rose from beneath the tree's shade with the particular hard-won peace of someone who had walked through profound loss and painful betrayal in close succession and emerged, not unscathed, never unscathed, but genuinely, durably whole, carrying David's memory forward, not as an open wound but as a steady, guiding presence, exactly as he had asked of her in that final, carefully prepared recorded message, urging her, even from beyond his own unexpected departure, toward healing rather than bitterness, toward courage rather than fear, toward a life that continued, however imperfectly, however unevenly, to move forward into its own genuine and hard-earned light.